said the other day, I'm ashamed that I voted for the 94 crime bill. You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
We will be able to show that they work. In the crime area, and I'll conclude with this, everybody's an expert. You don't have to know anything. You're entitled to your opinion. If we were talking about nuclear weapons, if we're talking about trade policy, if we're talking about 1,000 other things, people are wise enough to stop and say, I don't know much about that. But in this area, everyone thinks they're an expert. And so what happens is we proliferate stupid ideas.
Criminal, let him go to prison.
I have a life and 30-year sentence.
20 years for drug trafficking. I have life without parole for 3 ounces of methamphetamine.
Of the 2,600 people I've sent to federal prison, I've seen 3 or 4 kingpins. We're incarcerating poor people who are drug addicts.
You're watching poor, uneducated people be fed into a machine like meat to make sausage.
Law enforcement agencies get rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of drug arrests.
Money's ours now. That's my money now.
And by the way, we talk about this mostly in terms of Black Lives Matter. Black lives really do matter. But the problem is institutional racism in America. That's the overarching problem that still exists. And we should be talking about it. And you look at it, the legacy of racism in housing, and jobs, and so on. So,
the Republicans decided they didn't want President Clinton to succeed in his effort of getting a crime bill that has 51 death penalties, 100,000 cops, tens of thousands of new prison cells, and the list goes on. My Republican friends talk about in the health care bill they're going to read the bill. I'd like to go to the floor and read every provision of the crime bill and ask them what they're opposed to in the crime bill. Are they opposed to 100,000 more cops? Are they opposed to spending over $10 billion for new prisons?
but having said that, if you take a look at the crime bill, of the money in the crime bill, the vast majority went to reducing sentences, diverting people from going to jail for drug offenses into what I came up with, the drug courts. So you didn't relearn whatever the bad thing that, got you there in the first place. Put 100,000 cops in the street. When community policing was working, neighborhoods were not only safer, but they were more harmonious. And when the reason why the cops originally opposed my 100,000 cops for this community policing piece is because it's high intensive and it means they got to get out of their cars. So they literally got out of their cars and learned who owned the local drugstore, the local neighborhood bar, whatever. And they were engaged in the neighborhood, which built confidence so that the woman, the African-American woman living in a corner alone where the drug deal's going down in front of her house knows she literally used to have your phone number as a cop. She'd call you and say, John, they're out in front of my house, but you're not giving me away, right, John? No. And it didn't. So we had enormous success. Now what's happened is we've cut the funding 85%. We've gone out there and we're going through Baltimore now. Look at the areas we're going through here. I'll lay you 8-5. The Baltimore Police Department is considerably smaller than it was in 1985.
And ask them what they're opposed to in the crime bill. Are they opposed to 100,000 more cops? Are they opposed to spending over $10 billion for new prisons?
If Reagan had proposed $10 billion in new prison construction, there had been massive demonstrations. Reagan could not have put through this crime bill.
You got to put this in a broader context. And there were a lot of things about the crime bill, the 100,000 police force increase, the violence against women provisions, the assault weapons ban, which was part of the package, the Brady bill, which was part of the package. And, there was a lot that was put into place that contributed to the decline in crime that we are enjoying today. Thank goodness, because it's keeping a lot of people alive, uninjured, and communities safer.
Issue with that tough on crime stance. I mean, you can't get elected if you don't profess to be tough on crime.
First, we have to join together to ensure that drug dealers are punished swiftly, surely, and severely.
You can't stay elected if you don't do things to be tough on crime.
It's to toughen sentences, beef up law enforcement, and build new prison space for 24,000 inmates.
You know, nobody can afford to be the first guy to say, wait a minute, we can't afford what we're doing, let's do something different. Because if you even made a noise like you were going to be soft on crime in any way, you would be out of a job.
You will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
You said that this was not about bringing down the presidency, but to a lot of people, particularly here in the White House, there's a feeling that if the president cannot at least get a vote on the actual bill itself, that it will undercut his effectiveness across the board. Do you have some concerns about that?
Well, I think we're going to vote on a crime bill at some point, if not this session of Congress, next session of Congress. I believe we're going to do it this session of Congress. But there are certain things that we must talk about. We got to talk about capital punishment. We're talking about adding 60 more death penalties to the federal statute. We got to talk about 3 strikes you out. I mean, let's talk to the taxpayers in this country about building all these prisons and housing all these prisoners. I mean, this is going to be a serious fiscal impact on the taxpayers of this country when we start talking about incarcerating people for life. And that debate needs to be had.
So that you also give a little bit of background of what happened on the crime bill, because if we're going to move forward, it's helpful to know a little bit about what happened before. As Chairman Conyers has indicated, we have to try to improve the situation going forward. And one of the problems we have in the criminal justice area is the difference between good policy and good politics. They're absolutely separate and apart, opposite directions when you talk about the issue of crime. The United States Senate passed the crime bill with no hearings. They brought the bill to the floor, started making speeches, amendment after amendment, and when it finally loaded it up with some really good political sound bites, not good policy, good politics, then they sent it over to us. And with the leadership of Chairman Conyers and a few others, we insisted on hearings, I mean, almost unheard of, and delayed the bill until January. Based on those hearings, we got some good policy into the crime bill. We didn't get the politics out, but we got some good policy in. We got the prevention package, Local Partnership Act, which will be discussed, drug courts, assault weapons, and a number of other things that worked. We watered down some of the things that were bad, but I think we had a much better, although I didn't support it in the end, it was a much better package than it started out. One of the things that happens when you pass things like 3-time loser, death penalties, 13-year-olds as adults, abolish Pell Grants for prisoners, abolish parole, spend most of them more money on prisons than anything else. Although 99% of the crime is local and state and not federal, those kinds of initiatives give state legislators ideas as to what they ought to do. And shortly after the federal crime bill, or in the middle of the consideration, my state, Virginia, passed a 3-time loser bill, and they're in the process next week of considering abolishing parole. A $1 billion package, $400 million a year, and just on a national perspective, that's about $90 million per congressional district, about $35 million per congressional district after you've built the prisons. And the promise, if it works, you might reduce crime 2%. Now, we know a lot of things that we can do with that kind of money that would put a much bigger dent in crime than 2%.
What did the president say to you, and have you changed your mind on the crime bill?
No, I've not changed my mind at this point. I talked to the president about some very serious issues that are very compassionate to me, very emotional to me, and that is the death penalty and 3 strikes you out. I'm very serious when it comes to the death penalty, because I don't think the federal government ought to be adding 60 new death penalties into the crime bill, 1. And 2, 3 strikes you out is not something, in my opinion, will solve one crime in this country. We incarcerate in this country more people than any other industrialized country in America. At the end of 1993, we had 1.4 million people in jail. Building prisons is not the answer to the crime problem.
What would it take?
Which built confidence so that the woman, the African-American woman living in a corner alone where the drug deal's going down in front of her house, knows she literally used to have your phone number as a cop. She'd call you and say, John, they're out in front of my house, but you're not giving me away, right, John? No.
I have remained consistent in terms of trying to implement programs, laws, and other programs that will really address the problem, the comprehensive, the overall problem that we are confronted with in the African-American community, led primarily by jobs and economic development, the creation of small businesses. Also, schools are still suffering, housing, and decent housing in our communities. So, I mean, we have to look at the comprehensive approach. And the problem with the crime bill and its implementation was that it was singularly focused. It was focused on locking them up, keeping them in jail.
And it didn't. So we had enormous success. Now what's happened is we've cut the funding 85%. I'll lay you 8 to 5. The Baltimore Police Department is considerably smaller than it was in 1985. There are things I would change. I opposed, for example, the carjacking provision that the administration wanted in. But by and large, what it really did, it restored American cities.
Express my thanks to Congressman Scott. In the heat of the battle, who would not bow in the face of this criminal act called the crime bill. It is as if you've been disconnected from time and space back in the civil rights days. There is some assumption that these days of civil rights struggle have been suspended and are not yet upon us. The civil rights struggle, the racial justice struggle, the gender equality struggle continues. In biblical terms, that was a great celebration when David slew Goliath. But they didn't celebrate too long, because while they were glad that David beat Goliath, Goliath had sons, and the giants kept coming. So today we beat Jim Crow in the South, but Jim Crow Esquire keeps coming. And when Jim Crow was a wolf wearing wolf clothes, we were psychologically positioned to fight Jim Crow. But when Jim Crow goes to Yale or someplace and disguises his wolf instinct in sheep clothing, the Bible reminds us. When wolves come in sheep clothing, they are more deceptive. So if Bush says fast-track jobs in Mexico, we say no, we got to fight for our job. But if Clinton says NAFTA, we say, well, NAFTA that's a little different. It's the same thing. If Reagan had proposed a Howard Johnson 60 new flavors of killing plan, if Reagan had proposed $10 billion in new prison construction, while school systems in D.C. closed because of lack of capital improvement, and others should be closed for the same reason, there have been massive demonstrations. Reagan could not have put through this crime bill. Bush could not have put through this crime bill. It's a combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. And those who try to trade Kool-Aid off from cyanide didn't read Jim Jones' story. You cannot make that distinction. This is a criminal act.